Welcome to the Pivot Point podcast. This season, I'm focused on sharing stories and ideas from experts on diversity and inclusion. In this episode, I will share some insights and ideas from my guest expert, Michelle Cantor. Together, we will leave you with some actionable tips to think about and discuss with your organization. We share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. At Pivot Point, I believe we are stronger together. We are one. So let's dig into this week's expert. Today we have with us Michelle Cantor. She is founder of LAR Consulting. And for more than 20 years, Michelle has been the driver of thought leadership and strategic direction relative to organizational and talent development, including 8 years of change management consulting with Fortune 500 companies such as ComEd, Fiat Chrysler, Ford Motor Company, and Dow Chemical. Cantor initiated her career at Accenture and rose through the ranks from a performance consultant to operations lead for Accenture's North America Behavioral Interview Center. She honed her expertise in strategic planning as program lead for Accenture's Global Smart Grid consulting practice. Next, she became program lead of the organization's North America Strategy, Inclusion, and Diversity practice. And during her tenure in I&D, one of Cantor's key accomplishments was the successful development and implementation of a customized unconscious bias workshop that was delivered to 1,600 employees with 52 conducts over 3 months in North America. When she isn't working with adults on diversity, equity, and inclusion, she's focused on the next generation. She has 3 Gen Zs to raise alongside her husband of 20 years and is currently an executive board member for Living Arts, a nonprofit dedicated to providing transformative art experiences for Detroit's youth. Wow, what a plethora of experience Michelle's going to bring to us today. Michelle, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Julie. I'm really excited to be here. So thank you for having me.
Well, let's catch us up. You have this amazing breadth of experience in the trenches doing I&D work, which, by the way, I love I coming before the D. Tell us, how did you get into this line of work? What gets you fired up about diversity and inclusion?
So to be perfectly honest, I got into it kind of by accident and was hooked from, I would say, about day 7. So as you kind of read my bio, I had a really interesting career with Accenture where I was an employee for about 8-9 years doing human performance consulting for Accenture at large clients, as you named, like Dow, Ford, Chrysler, etc. And then to be able to have more work-life balance, I actually went internally as a contractor, and so did consulting for Accenture internally. Basically, they were my client, and was able to do a whole breadth of different leadership roles for them, as you mentioned. My last role was in an I&D role. Basically, I'd been in an operations role. The woman I was working with, we both agreed that at a certain point, kind of the value I could add was going to start diminishing. It was a very technical business, and I didn't have that engineering background, and I knew it. So as I started kind of networking around and seeing what other roles, other consulting roles Accenture would need help with, basically someone called me up and tapped me on the shoulder and said the I&D lead for our North America strategy practice just gave notice, and we need somebody with your crazy, amazing, long experience in human performance and organizational development. And I kind of knew, like, how you have sort of those moments where this is just going to be a really amazing opportunity. And so I jumped in. And for me, it started being kind of the sort of the arms around all the experience I'd had, and that every single sort of story I'd heard, every single situation of human performance, right, relates in some element back to I&D, right? And so that for me really kind of became the theme of human performance and developing talent. And so as I got deeper and deeper into it, I really just kind of every day convinced of how important this is, right? And how it becomes even more important as we're dealing with multiple generations in a workplace, as we're dealing with women still, trying to, I actually don't call it a glass ceiling. I talk about it being the wall that we're trying to climb over, as our minorities, rightly so, are growing in this country and want to have a seat at the table. And so I think it's just, one of the most relevant topics of our day, quite frankly.
Yeah. Well, it's so many great things in your story. One, how serendipitous the world can be with careers, right? Working a lot with women leaders, they'll say that like, well, this opportunity came across, but I've never done that before. Whereas men will just be like, yes, let's go in. Like, I can do it. And so I love that you didn't doubt. You thought, no, this really parlays to the experience I already have, especially the change management piece, which we're going to dive into, the connections to I&D with that. But also just really dialed into your purpose. It really sounds like this is a part of your why. I often talk about the business case, like you said, with minorities and growing populations. And of course, from a gender perspective, we want all genders to feel welcome in the workplace. But there's the human case, the personal connection to it too. So really having that, coming at it from both sides, is important. So Michelle, you launched a bunch of initiatives at Accenture, and in particular, the unconscious bias training really sticks out to me as something that it's a hot topic. A lot of organizations, big companies, have checked the box and done the training. A lot of the companies I work with want to start with unconscious bias training, and they've done nothing else for inclusion. Like, that's an interesting place to start, telling people they're biased. So what are your thoughts on unconscious bias and how to get that conversation started in an organization?
That's a great question. So, I do think of, and I think it goes back to why I became so passionate about this topic, is because, my whole focus in terms of consulting is on people there, but I'm very much about, the data that substantiates, right, why we need to optimize our workplace for every person. And so to me, when I started learning about unconscious bias and the science behind it, it is the great equalizer in every single one of us, right? So none of us don't have it. It's just scientifically impossible. It's how our brains work. And, add to that we're all grow up in society and are surrounded by family, friends, our norms that either, reinforce or challenge some of those biases. So I actually think, depending upon an organization, the unconscious bias workshops, when done appropriately, can be a really good foundation of beginning I&D work. But the thing that I always really emphasize is this is a journey, right? And it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so these workshops can be a great starting point, but they're not your beginning, middle, and end.
Mm-hmm.
And they also need to be wrapped in really clear and intentional communication about why these are being done and truly what the anticipated outcome is.
Mm-hmm.
And
Two
so,
keys, the
yes,
why and the WIFM. The two W's with any change is so important. Why are we doing this from an organizational perspective? And what's in it for me? How are we going to benefit on the other side of it?
right, yes. And really getting people to start thinking about it. Because in any change journey, right, we got to kind of look at ourselves first and then be able to look at things collectively.
Yep. Yeah, it reminds me of a story I had with a client earlier this year. They did an employee engagement survey, and for the first time, they added the I&D questions, and they didn't like the results that they got on those
Yeah.
questions. And they asked good questions, and the responses were honest. And I think that's a great signal that people felt safe to voice their opinions. So they then bring me in for focus groups to unpack, okay, what does this mean? And that was exactly what they said. Why does this matter? Is this a flavor of the month program? It feels like some top-down initiative that we're checking a box on. And here I am in a room of people that are people of color and women talking about issues that affect us. Where's the majority group in this conversation? So I'm curious, with your deep expertise in change management and the I&D focus, inclusion and diversity, where do you see the intersection of these two? Like, how do they run in similar veins, and how do you leverage the change tools for your I&D practice?
It's a great question. So I do it throughout the journey. And I will, meet with a client, and depending on kind of where they are or they aren't in their journey, recommend different ways to start. And so sometimes it is starting with a workshop and kind of getting employees kind of taking down sort of the defense mechanisms and the concerns and the fear, because I think there's a lot of fear out there right now, so much, because the good news is there's a lot more conversation out there about I&D, but there's also more fear and uncertainty, and defenses are up. And so really kind of taking a pulse on the culture of the client, maybe that's the place to start and kind of get everybody understanding, right? We really are all in this together because our brains really do all work the same way. And then start working towards understanding that this is a journey then. And then ultimately, it always needs to come back to leadership, and leadership for those workshops, and then leadership through the rest of the journey has got to be involved. And at some point, it is a matter of looking at this strategically. And leadership really has to figure out what the who, what, and the why of their DE&I journey, right? Because the other thing that I think is really key and really needs to be a best practice is that we have these terms out in the environment and out in the workplace, but nobody really understands how to define them. And so one of the very, very first things I do with leadership is we define what those terms are for their organization, right? Because for each organization, that will look different. And the other thing we need to do is, going back to that business case, is I guarantee you can sit in a room with the top leadership, and they have a different reason, every single one of them, for why they're doing this. And so any change, leadership has to all be in the same direction and understanding and agreeing on where they want to get to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, having that aligned why, and then also that aligned path going forward.
Yeah.
Great.
And that's not easy work. I mean, I just finished doing it with a client, and, you have to, it's not easy. You got to really, really think it through, and you've got to really be willing to discuss and tear it down and then kind of build it back up again. But when you get there, it's amazing, right? How much leadership not only is in agreement on the direction, but their ability to articulate that direction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? And to be very clear now in understanding as they move into the next steps of where they're trying to get to.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the business case for it. And the good folks at Harvard have published a plethora of data on the business case for DI.
Yes, right.
And, I'm always puzzled by the fact that this research has been around for over a decade. And it's continuously published and shared, and people are aware. I think most people in rooms where I'm training, I'll have people show of hands who've seen some of this data. Most people have seen something about the benefits of I&D. Help me understand, what do you think? Why do you think that we have such awareness around why it matters from a business case, and yet just lack of results and traction at the same time?
Well, I think there's a couple reasons. I think number one is, you can see the data, but still not internalize that impacts you or your business, right? So frankly, there's a lot of businesses that it's so much easier just to continue doing things the same way, right? So I think that's number one of the reasons. I think one of the other reasons is, there is fear around this. And, I'm not going to lie, and this too, right? This work is messy, right? It's like I said, it's going through the things, making the definitions, and you have to be willing to get in and kind of get your hands dirty and start really thinking through this stuff. And so it's easier kind of, and there's fear about doing that. But I think the other thing too is that a lot of organizations that are getting in and doing the work, and kudos to them for doing it, but a lot of it is around reactivity rather than proactivity. And so what I mean by that is, oh my gosh, we have a diverse workforce. There's business benefits out there. We got to jump on and we got to start doing some things, right? And it's well intentioned, but like I said, it always ties back to leadership in your strategy. And if you don't really have clear definitions and clear intent and purpose, then you're just kind of on a hamster wheel potentially and not really getting to a result.
Yeah, people are constantly looking for that like magic bullet solution. I don't
Yeah,
know how many
it's
podcasts
not.
I've been on, panels I've been on, like, just tell me one thing to do. And you're right, it's messy. I like that word messy, but it does evoke fear in people. And it is a journey, it's not a destination. So it's a series of intentional conversations, intentional messaging, intentional trainings, education, to close the gap. So it's not a one and done, and it's not a business initiative. I get frustrated when my clients use language like that. Like, this is a cultural transformation. This is something that takes time. Initiative signals that we're just in it for the next year or so, and then we're going to check and be done. So with that said, Michelle, do you have a story, an example, an idea from a client that has been able to really make traction in I&D?
Yeah, I mean, I think in recruiting is one of the areas where companies have been able to make traction. I think one of the pitfalls is companies are doing a better job of bringing in kind of diverse perspectives and diverse people, not doing always such a good job of realizing that their culture may not be supporting, right, all those different viewpoints and experiences and cultures. But I think there's a couple things in terms of recruiting. And again, I want to warn, people not to just jump in and do it, right? You need to be intentional about it, and it needs to be tied back to your organization and where you're trying to get to. But, how you word job descriptions, right? And really looking at kind of what's the potential bias in it, in just of wording that may feel more masculine or feminine, like talking about we need a ninja warrior. And while a ninja warrior maybe can be any gender, right? Given being aware of societal norms and right, and what bias that may be potentially doing. I think the other really big thing is that, and I was in recruiting for years, so I know we did this, right? We create these job descriptions that basically no human being, right, can really satisfy. And so I think, why we create this, it's our wish list, right? But what that wish list does, and especially when we're trying to create people coming from different viewpoints as experiences, is it narrows the gap of who will perceive themselves as qualified or capable of that job. So one of the key things I'm doing with a client right now is really getting, because they have they're a niche area in terms of what their organization does, but really challenging them, like, do you really need to require that level of education? Do you really need to be saying that number of years of job experience? And, do you really need to be listing all of this stuff? Like, let's really get down to the bare bones and minimize kind of these lists. And I think the last one thing is actual people who are applying for jobs themselves. And I know you kind of touched on this, and I know it's a statistic that's been out there, and I've heard you mention on other podcasts, is that in terms of gender, women tend to look at a job posting, and if they look to be able to do 100% of it. They're literally going line by line and checking what they can and can't do. And males in general are looking at that and saying, oh, I can do 60% of this,
Right.
I'm all in. And so that too is why we really need to be cognizant of the message that we're sending in these job descriptions.
Yeah, one of my biggest pet peeves in this work is, and you did such a great job of showing the other side of that, is people will say, I really do want more diverse candidates to apply for the position. However, I can't lower the standards for
Right.
No, there's a bias there, right? So what about diverse types of talent signals that they're not meeting the standards? Number one, let's unpack that. And number two, to your point, are these really necessary jobs and skills? If you're having trouble recruiting people, which I don't know of a company right now with unemployment being so low that is getting the people that they want at the pace they want, you have no choice but to change your strategy. It's one of my allies, Karen Catlin, has found an analogy to fishing. When you go fishing and you don't catch fish, do you blame the fish?
Right.
We don't blame the fish, we blame our technique. We change something about how we're fishing. Same goes for recruiting. So think about how you can't go back to the same honey pot and find different honey. You got to diversify where you go looking, how you approach it, your job descriptions. Which brings me to the second idea you triggered for me is I had a client, this was just last month. This is late 2019. A client literally shared with me that they went through their job descriptions and found all this biased language in it when they went in looking for it. They had the
Right.
word quarterback in there. From a cultural perspective, the words that we use that are analogies to American sports or to things that if you're from a different culture, you're just not going to understand what it means to be on base or to hit a home run. These types of analogies are everywhere. And so it's confusing language that, again, signals for the majority group, this is the job for you. It's not the job for others. Uh,
Right. And it's also sending the signal, this is what our culture's like,
mhm.
right? So if we're using that kind of verbiage, whether a candidate is looking at that and again realizes how their brain's processing that, right? But we look for patterns, and is going to then think, oh, this is a culture that is highly about sports and competitive, and their brain is going to go down a path. And so you really are. That's kind of the first window into an organization are those job descriptions and the criteria that they're looking for.
Well, and then to your point about you have to be inclusive to drive diversity, thus the inverse of the acronym with I&D versus traditionally D&I, which I'm starting to see a lot more often. What's the point of recruiting, even if you're lucky enough to hire, diverse types of talent and they don't stay, right? So the
Right.
data shows it's usually a 3x rate that you're losing underrepresented groups to the majority group. And I had a client recently that really illustrated this really great, a tech company and in financial services. So take whatever, it's every industry, it's every function, but just take that for what it is, that a woman of color started working there and she was excited, right? And she tells her family, she tells her, past coworkers, and all of them had the same response to her, like, we'll see how long you last there,
Right.
right? I give it a year. And as I looked around in that room as she was sharing that story at, mostly majority group white men, they were just baffled. Like, who would tell you that? No one's told me that before, right? So these subtle signals every day that you don't belong. And of course, you're fighting an uphill battle with that mentality of, I don't even belong here. My family doesn't even think I'm going to stay.
Right.
And so you have to build that culture of inclusion. Both of them on the good side of it said, but here's why I stayed. And here's how people have been allies for me. Here's how I've been supported. I'm very happy here. So it was a great ending to that story, but it could have gone awry had they not had that culture of inclusion.
Well, and here's the other side of it in terms of I had a client who, because this concept of kind of onlys, right? That an African American woman, for example, like you're talking about, comes into an organization and she's looking around and she really doesn't see anybody who is like her. And for those folks, it can be a very lonely, they really have the hardest to kind of start that journey and to be able to build more of a pipeline and more of a culture that is more inclusive. But and I had at a client, I was doing one of these workshops, and this is going to sound, I had somebody that I was leading with, and this question was so insulting to them. But that's part of the work that you have to do is when you're in this, you really have to be able to hear the honest questions and the honest sort of perceptions that people have, right? Because now you really do start unpacking it, breaking it down. But so we were talking about this sort of only, right? Looking around the room of this organization and seeing that there are a handful, right, of people that look different from the rest of the group. And so an individual, a white male, was like, well, then should we even be hiring people like that? Because then they're just not going to feel like they don't feel comfortable. right? And it's astonishing to hear because as I&D people, well, yes, of course you do. But from his perspective, right, what he was saying, right, is if somebody's not, they're not going to feel comfortable, then why put them through that, right?
Mhm.
And so it was a really good moment. It was a really transformative moment where, first I sort of gave it back to the room, right? What do you kind of all think about this? And the response was exactly kind of what you would hope for as an I&D expert was, somebody said, well, no, I mean, that's not the solution. That just kind of perpetuates our cycle. And we need to do a better job of creating a culture where people feel included and people want to be here that come from different backgrounds and races and perspectives and genders and all of that good stuff. So it was a great moment, right, that they were able to give each other kind of this aha moment of, we all have to get out of our comfort zone. And that's one of the biggest tips is that I always give in the work I do is that each and every one of us, in order to really move the needle and the dial on this work, we all have to be willing to get out of our comfort zone.
Yeah, I call them brave spaces. I used to call them
Yeah.
safe places, but like you said, that's not a safe place comment. And sometimes, I mean, when someone says something you're really getting it, you're getting to the heart of something because that statement was filled, it was somewhat biased too of, hey, like it's a choice that we don't have to hire those types of people, right?
It
And
was completely biased, but it
right,
was also, kudos for that. Like if
right,
they hadn't said that, right, we
exactly.
wouldn't have had that aha moment of people realizing like we're all sitting here in our comfort zones. We don't want to be uncomfortable. We're not, so we're not going to make someone else uncomfortable, but we're not creating an inclusive environment, right? For the people who
That's
are,
the real problem.
for the people to come. Like this, it doesn't work. But if somebody hadn't been honest enough to kind of really show their bias, that change wouldn't have happened in that
Right.
room.
Yeah, you need people to say those things. When I see comments like that on a feedback form afterwards, it's like the meeting after the meeting's happening somewhere.
Right.
Like this isn't real. You were just harboring all your thoughts and then you're going to write it down later.
Yeah,
Y-
and it's not gonna change your viewpoint and anybody else's, right? Who
Mm-mm.
could have learned. So that's why I mean, like, a lot of this is messy and a lot of it is uncomfortable, and you need the right people in the room to really help facilitate and
Mm,
move that towards positive change,
right.
rather than what a lot of these organizations fear, right?
Or
Is
shame somebody when they
repercussions of somebody
step out of
saying
bounds. Like, oh
that
my
and
gosh.
that and some, there's a can of worms that they're afraid it's going to open.
Yep. Yep. I get that feedback a lot. Like, whoa, if you come in, this is going to open a can of worms. Like, yeah, it might, but here's why that's a good thing. And rather than judging people, because I'm sure his comment came from a good place of positive intent, just wasn't aware of how that could be perceived. And he was educated in that moment. So that's really bringing together best practices for a healthy D&I conversation. And the way you threw it back at the groove, well, what do you all think? Great facilitation technique, right? You don't have to correct him. The rest can
Right.
chime in and do that.
Right.
So
Yeah. I mean, it was good. It was a uncomfortable and a moment of growth for the
I
people.
call it a teachable moment.
Yeah. It's a very teachable moment.
Well, Michelle, we're almost out of time. Tell us, I know, again, no magic bullet, no remedy for the D&I challenges that I'm sure most of our listeners face. But if you had to offer one thing for our listeners to take away with, what would you pick?
So I think from an individual perspective, I think this getting out of your comfort zone is really important. So if you'll forgive me and let me kind of offer three key things for an individual to take away is, get out of your comfort zone. The other is ask, don't assume. So I think we are a culture, and this is where bias happens, right? We hear a statement, we make an assumption, just like this individual, right? Like that could have gone with just a full array of assumptions about that individual. So you need to be willing to ask questions. Don't make assumptions about people. Really try and get to know each other. And then one of the really important things, I think it is so important in organizations where everybody's moving so fast, is slow down. Like when you see your head going down towards, like you make a decision quickly. And so you decide, okay, I'm just going to go with my gut instinct. Well, our instincts can be good, but our instincts are fraught with bias. And so you need to slow yourself down and really try and be more methodical and more, objective rather than subjective in your decision making.
Yeah. Some great takeaways there, Michelle. Well, thank you so much for being a guest today. I appreciate your thought leadership, your experience, your stories. I know there's a treasure trove of information I'm taking away.
Well, thank you. It was a great chance for the two of us to connect. I loved it. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who's listening.
And Michelle, do let our listeners know what is the best way to get in touch with you and follow you?
Oh, great, great. So they can follow my website, which is Volar Consulting, VOLAR Consulting. They can also email me at Michelle@Volar Consulting. I'm on LinkedIn under my name, Michelle Cantor, and my business. And most importantly, people really can pick up a phone and just call me. I have my phone with me all the time, 248-705-9008.
All right. Well, wow, that's a great way to connect live. So thank you for this content, Michelle. Um, and we're very thankful to have had you on the show.
Well, thank you again.
Did you know that you can find all 5 seasons of our 50 plus episodes at nextpivotpoint.com? And you can sign up for the complimentary 7-day preview of our new program, Lead Like an Ally, and order our new book, Lead Like an Ally. I appreciate you listening to this episode. Who do you know that needs to hear this message? Hit the share button and connect with me on LinkedIn. Simply search Julie Kratz, Kratz. I post every single day about these topics. I host this podcast because I believe we are stronger together. We are one.